The village of Tan Phu sat nestled in the Mekong Delta, surrounded by rice paddies that stretched to the horizon like mirrors reflecting the heavy sky. In 1965, it was home to roughly 300 people, most of them farmers who had lived off this land for generations. Among them were children who spent their days helping in the fields, swimming in the canals, and attending the small village school, where a single teacher tried to educate 30 students of varying ages in a one-room building with a dirt floor. These children knew nothing of ideology or politics. They knew rice planting seasons, the taste of fresh fish from the river, and the stories their grandparents told about ancestors who had farmed these same fields. They had no way of knowing that within months their childhood would end and they would be thrust into a war that would consume everything they knew. The war came to Tan Phu not with a single dramatic moment, but as a creeping shadow that gradually darkened every aspect of village life. First came the government soldiers from Saigon, setting up checkpoints on the roads, searching homes for weapons or signs of Viet Cong activity. The villagers, caught between forces they did not fully understand, tried to maintain neutrality, offering cooperation to whoever held power at any given moment. But neutrality was not an option the war would permit. Then came the Viet Cong, arriving at night, holding meetings in the village square, talking about liberation and independence, about driving out foreign invaders and reunifying Vietnam under communist rule. They asked for food, for information, for sons to join their cause. Nguyen Van Tam was 12 years old when the Viet Cong recruiters first came to his home. They arrived after dark, 3 men in simple black clothing carrying AK-47 rifles, and they spoke with his father in low, urgent tones while Tom and his younger siblings huddled in the corner of their small house. The men explained that the revolution needed everyone, that even children could serve the cause. They spoke of American imperialism, of the corrupt Saigon government, of the glorious future awaiting a unified Vietnam. Tom's father, a rice farmer who wanted nothing more than to be left alone to work his land, listened in silence, knowing that refusal was not truly an option. When the men left, they took Tom with them. The recruitment of children by the Viet Cong was neither official policy nor particularly secret. It happened throughout South Vietnam, in countless villages where the insurgency needed bodies to fill roles that did not require full military training. Children became messengers, carrying communications between units. They served as scouts, their small size and innocent appearance allowing them to move through areas where adult fighters would draw suspicion. They laid booby traps, their small hands able to work in confined spaces. They dug tunnels and served as porters, carrying supplies along jungle trails. Some, as they grew older and proved themselves reliable, were eventually given weapons and became combatants. The Viet Cong called them little soldiers of liberation. The Americans and South Vietnamese forces would come to call them something else, a nightmare they were never prepared to face. Tom's training, if it could be called that, lasted less than 2 weeks. He was taken to a camp deeper in the jungle where he joined about 20 other boys ranging from ages 10 to 15. The older boys taught the younger ones. They learned to recognize American and South Vietnamese uniforms, to spot helicopters by their sound, to move silently through the jungle, to set simple traps using grenades and tripwires. They learned which plants were edible and which streams were safe to drink from. They learned to sleep in hammocks strung between trees and to wake at the slightest unusual sound. But more than anything, they learned fear. Fear of the American planes that roared overhead dropping bombs. Fear of the gunships that could appear without warning and shred the jungle with machine gun fire. Fear of making mistakes that would endanger their comrades. The indoctrination was constant, but not particularly sophisticated. The cadres who ran the training camps spoke endlessly about the righteousness of their cause, about the evils of American imperialism and the puppet government in Saigon. They showed the children photographs of villages destroyed by bombing, of civilians killed in military operations, of the suffering inflicted by the war. For boys like Tom, who had seen South Vietnamese soldiers burn homes suspected of harboring Viet Cong sympathizers, and who had watched American planes drop napalm on nearby villages, the propaganda found fertile ground. The war had already taken their innocence. The Viet Cong offered them purpose, identity, and the promise that their suffering served a greater cause. Within months, Tom had transformed from a rice farmer's son into something else entirely. He no longer attended school or helped in the paddies. Instead, he spent his days moving through the jungle with his unit, carrying messages, scouting American positions, and helping to prepare ambush sites. He learned to recognize the different sounds of American weapons, the crack of M16 rifles versus the heavier boom of M60 machine guns. He learned to estimate the distance of artillery fire by counting seconds between the flash and the sound. He learned to stay absolutely still when helicopters passed overhead, barely breathing, knowing that movement meant death. And he learned to live with hunger that gnawed constantly, with exhaustion that never fully lifted, with fear that became as natural as breathing. The first time Tom saw Americans up close was during an ambush in late 1965. His unit had been tracking a patrol of about 15 soldiers through the jungle for most of a day, waiting for the right moment to strike. Tom's role was to observe and report, nothing more. He crouched in thick vegetation about 50 meters from the trail, watching the Americans move past. They looked impossibly large to him, carrying enormous packs, their faces red and sweating in the heat. Some looked barely older than the teenagers in his own unit. When the ambush was triggered, the jungle exploded with gunfire. Tom watched soldiers fall, heard screaming in English and Vietnamese, saw the chaos as the Americans tried to return fire against an enemy they could not see. The firefight lasted perhaps 5 minutes. When it ended, 4 Americans lay dead or dying on the trail. The Viet Cong melted into the jungle, and Tom followed, his hands shaking, his mind trying to process what he had just witnessed. As 1965 turned into 1966, American military presence in Vietnam increased dramatically. The strategy of search and destroy meant that American units moved constantly through the countryside, seeking out Viet Cong fighters and base camps. For the child soldiers of the Viet Cong, this meant constant movement, constant danger, and constant encounters with a military force that possessed overwhelming firepower. The children learned to recognize the signs of approaching American operations: increased helicopter activity, the distant sound of artillery softening an area before ground troops moved in, the jets that screamed overhead before unleashing their ordnance. They learned to dig, to hide, to scatter and reassemble at predetermined locations, and they learned to fight when there was no other option. The tunnel systems that became famous during the Vietnam War were partly built by children. Their small bodies could fit into spaces that adults could not access, making them ideal for the exhausting, claustrophobic work of tunneling. Tom spent weeks underground during the dry season of 1966, helping to expand a tunnel network that would serve as a base for his unit. The work was brutal. The air below ground was thick and hot, difficult to breathe. The tunnels were barely wide enough to crawl through, and the constant fear of collapse made every moment terrifying. They dug with simple tools, removing earth bucket by bucket, shoring up walls with whatever materials they could scavenge. But the tunnels meant survival. When American forces swept through an area, the Viet Cong simply disappeared underground, waiting in the darkness until the danger passed. The American soldiers who encountered child combatants faced a moral and psychological crisis for which they had received no training. How do you shoot a child? How do you treat a 12-year-old carrying an AK-47 as an enemy combatant? Some soldiers could not do it, hesitating in moments that sometimes cost them their lives. Others hardened themselves, learning to see any Vietnamese person, regardless of age, as a potential threat. The children exploited this hesitation. They knew that Americans often paused when confronted with young faces, and that pause could be the difference between life and death. Some child soldiers were sent specifically to approach American positions, appearing innocent and harmless, only to throw grenades or trigger explosives when soldiers let their guard down. In March 1967, Tom's luck ran out. His unit was caught in an American operation near the village of Binh Ja. The Americans had surrounded the area during the night, and when the Viet Cong tried to break out at dawn, they walked into overwhelming firepower. The firefight was brief and one-sided. Helicopters appeared overhead, gunships that raked the jungle with machine gun fire. Artillery fell in waves, turning the forest into a hellscape of explosions and flying shrapnel. Tom ran with his comrades, trying to reach the tree line, but a helicopter gunship cut them off. He saw the boys ahead of him cut down, saw bodies torn apart by machine gun fire. Then something hit him hard in the leg, and he fell, the jungle spinning around him as pain exploded through his body. When he woke, he was in American hands. He lay on the ground, his leg roughly bandaged, surrounded by soldiers speaking a language he did not understand. He was 13 years old, wounded and terrified. The Americans searched him, finding the small bag of rice he carried and a letter he had been transporting from one Viet Cong commander to another. They spoke to each other urgently, pointing at him, clearly trying to decide what to do with a child they had just captured in combat. One soldier, barely older than Tom himself, gave him water. Another called for a medic. The humanity of these small gestures confused him. He had been taught that Americans were monsters who killed without mercy. Yet here they were, treating his wound, giving him water, handling him with what seemed like reluctance rather than hatred. The American policy regarding captured Viet Cong, including children, was complicated and often contradictory. Officially, prisoners were to be turned over to South Vietnamese authorities for processing and detention. In practice, what happened to prisoners varied enormously depending on the unit that captured them, the circumstances of capture, and the mood of individual soldiers and officers. Child prisoners presented a particular problem. They were clearly combatants, often captured with weapons or in the midst of hostile action. But they were also children, some barely into their teens. The moral complexity of imprisoning children, or worse, treating them as adult enemy soldiers, created dilemmas that military doctrine had never adequately addressed. Tom was taken to a South Vietnamese military base and turned over to ARVN forces. The South Vietnamese had no special provisions for child prisoners. He was processed like any other captured Viet Cong fighter, photographed, fingerprinted, interrogated. The interrogation was not gentle. The South Vietnamese intelligence officers wanted to know everything: the location of his unit, the names of commanders, the details of tunnel systems, upcoming operations. When he refused to answer or claimed not to know, they hit him. When that did not work, they tried other methods. For a boy who had spent 2 years learning to see the Saigon government as the enemy, this treatment confirmed everything he had been taught. He told them nothing useful, absorbing the beatings with a stubbornness born of ideology and fear. Eventually, Tom was transferred to a detention facility near Saigon that housed captured Viet Cong fighters and suspects. The conditions were harsh. Hundreds of prisoners crowded into compounds surrounded by wire and guard towers. Food was minimal, medical care almost non-existent. Disease ran rampant. The adult prisoners organized themselves according to their own hierarchies, and the children, unless they had protection, fell to the bottom of this brutal social order. Tom found himself in a world where survival meant constant vigilance, where showing weakness invited exploitation, where the strong took from the weak and the guards looked the other way or participated in the abuse themselves. Among the prisoners were other children, some even younger than Tom. They formed their own groups for protection, sharing food when they had it, watching each other's backs, trying to survive in an environment designed to break adults, let alone children. Many of the child prisoners had similar stories. They had been recruited or forced into service by the Viet Cong, had served as messengers or laborers or fighters, and had been captured during operations. Some had been with the Viet Cong for months, others for years. A few had been born into it, children of fighters who had grown up knowing nothing but war and ideology. They were, in a terrible sense, the purest products of the war. Children who had never known peace, whose entire understanding of the world was shaped by conflict. The years passed slowly in detention. Tom turned 14, then 15, then 16, marking time by the changing of seasons and the occasional news that filtered into the camp about the war's progress. The older prisoners, hardened veterans of the revolution, continued their indoctrination even in captivity, holding classes where they taught political theory and maintained ideological purity. For the younger prisoners, including Tom, these sessions provided structure and purpose in a world otherwise defined by monotony and suffering. They clung to the belief that their sacrifice had meaning, that the revolution would ultimately triumph, that their suffering would be vindicated by history. The treatment of prisoners improved slightly as the war dragged on, and international attention focused on the conditions in South Vietnamese detention facilities. The Red Cross gained limited access, and the worst abuses were curbed, though conditions remained harsh. But for the children, the damage was already done. Years spent in detention during the critical period of adolescence had robbed them of education, of normal social development, of any chance at an ordinary life. They had entered as children and were emerging as young adults shaped entirely by war and captivity, carrying traumas that would never fully heal. In 1973, as the Paris Peace Accords brought a temporary halt to American involvement in the war, prisoner exchanges began. Tom, now 18 years old, was among those released. He walked out of the detention facility into a world that felt utterly foreign. Saigon around him bustled with life that seemed disconnected from the war that still raged in the countryside. People sold goods in markets, drove motorcycles through crowded streets, went about their lives as though the conflict was something distant and abstract. For Tom, who had spent 6 years either fighting or imprisoned, this normalcy was incomprehensible. He had no family to return to. His village had been destroyed years earlier, his parents' fate unknown. He had no education, no skills except those related to warfare and survival. He was a ghost, a remnant of a conflict that had consumed his childhood and adolescence and left him with nothing. He made his way north, moving through a country torn by resumed fighting as North Vietnamese forces prepared for their final push. The revolution that had demanded his childhood was about to achieve victory. But Tom felt no joy at the prospect. The years of fighting and captivity had hollowed him out, leaving behind someone who could barely remember the rice farmer's son, who had once helped his father in the paddies. He carried wounds that would never fully heal, physical scars from the bullet that had torn through his leg, and psychological scars from the years of violence and captivity that had defined his transformation from child to soldier to prisoner. When Saigon fell in April 1975, Tom watched the final collapse with mixed emotions. The revolution had won, The cause for which he had fought, for which he had sacrificed his childhood, triumphed, but the victory felt hollow. The unified Vietnam that emerged from the war was not the paradise the cadres had promised. It was a country devastated by decades of conflict, economically ruined, politically rigid, struggling under the weight of reunification and the challenges of peacetime governance. For those like Tom, who had given everything to the cause, there was little reward. They were veterans of a victorious revolution, but they were also reminders of the costs the new government preferred not to dwell upon. The government's treatment of former child soldiers was inconsistent and often dismissive. Some received recognition for their service and small pensions. Others received nothing, deemed too young to have truly served, or suspected of exaggerating their contributions. The psychological support they desperately needed did not exist. Vietnam had no infrastructure for treating trauma, no understanding of what we now call PTSD, no programs designed to help child soldiers reintegrate into civilian society. They were expected to simply move on, to put the war behind them and contribute to building the new Vietnam. But moving on was impossible when the war had stolen everything that should have prepared them for peacetime. Tom drifted through the post-war years, unable to settle, unable to find peace. He worked whatever jobs he could find, manual labor mostly, his damaged leg making sustained physical work difficult. He struggled with nightmares that replayed moments from the war, the firefights, the terror of American bombing runs, the years of detention. He struggled with anger that had no outlet, with depression that he could not name or understand. He struggled with the fundamental question of what his sacrifice had meant, whether the years stolen from him had purchased anything worth their cost. He was not alone in this struggle. Throughout Vietnam, former child soldiers grappled with similar demons. They had been used by the revolution, their youth and innocence weaponized in service of a cause that had ultimately consumed them. Many could not reintegrate. Some turned to alcohol or drugs, self-medicating traumas they could not otherwise address. Others became violent, unable to turn off the survival instincts that years of warfare had embedded in their psyches. Still others simply disappeared into the margins of Vietnamese society, forgotten casualties of a war that had no category for what they had endured. It was not until decades later, as Vietnam began to more openly examine the war's costs, that the stories of child soldiers began to emerge. Historians and filmmakers sought out survivors, recording testimonies before they were lost to time. Tom, in his 60s, finally agreed to speak publicly about his experiences. The process was difficult, forcing him to confront memories he had spent decades trying to suppress. But he also found it necessary. The children who had fought and died deserved to be remembered not as propaganda symbols or statistics, but as individuals who had been denied the childhood that should have been their birthright. The numbers remain uncertain. No reliable records exist for how many children were recruited by the Viet Cong during the war. Estimates range from thousands to tens of thousands, but the true figure is probably unknowable. Many died without ever being formally recorded as combatants. Others disappeared into the chaos of the war, their fates unknown. Still others survived but never spoke of their experiences, carrying their stories in silence to the grave. The American military, too, kept inadequate records of child combatants encountered and captured. They were often classified simply as enemy fighters with no notation of age, or were turned over to South Vietnamese forces and disappeared into a detention system that maintained poor records. What is certain is that the use of children as combatants was one of the war's many moral catastrophes.
The Viet Cong's recruitment of children represented a desperate calculation that victory justified any means, including the exploitation of those least able to refuse. The American and South Vietnamese response, treating child combatants as adult enemies or detaining them in conditions designed for hardened soldiers, reflected the impossibility of fighting a war where traditional distinctions between combatant and non-combatant had collapsed. The children caught in between paid prices that no ideology or strategic necessity could justify. For Tom and others like him, the war never truly ended. It lived on in dreams and memories, in damaged bodies and scarred psyches, in lives shaped entirely by conflict during years that should have been spent in classrooms and playing fields. They had been robbed not just of specific experiences, but of the entire developmental process that transforms children into well-adjusted adults. They had skipped over critical stages, jumping directly from childhood to a kind of premature, traumatized adulthood that left them ill-equipped for normal life. The international community's recognition of child soldiers as a specific category of war victim came too late for Vietnam's youngest combatants. The 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child and subsequent protocols prohibiting the use of children in armed conflict were drafted partly in response to conflicts like Vietnam, but they offered no retroactive justice or support for those who had already been victimized. The former child soldiers of Vietnam remained largely invisible, their suffering unacknowledged in the broader narratives about the war that focused on American experiences or the geopolitical dimensions of the Cold War conflict.